Welcome to The Real News. I'm Joo-hyun Park, and I'll be your host for this episode. Today, we'll be discussing APEC, or the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and the IPEF, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, two U.S. trade initiatives in the Pacific region that seek to uphold American economic dominance over the world at the expense of workers, the environment, and very possibly a peaceful future. We'll be speaking with Nina Macapinlac of Bayan USA, a core organization at the helm of the No to APEC Coalition that shut down the recent APEC summit in San Francisco, attended by the leaders of 20 countries from across the Pacific Rim. As always, before we begin, I'd like to thank all the listeners and readers of this program on behalf of the entire Real News team. The Real News is a totally independent and not for profit outlet dedicated to uplifting the stories of working people and popular struggles around the world. We don't take corporate cash, we don't run ads, and we don't do paid subscriptions. Our operations depend on the generosity of hardworking people like you. As we approach the end of the year, we're in a final push to secure our funding for the year to come. 2024 is going to be momentous, and you need all the information you can get to be equipped effectively to help make change in this world. Help us help you by pitching in to sustain our work at The Real News. Visit therealnews.com/donate. Every dollar you give helps power our reporting and keep you informed about the events and trends shaping the world around us. Last month, from November 11th to 17th, 20 world leaders gathered in San Francisco for the 2023 APEC Summit. Their presence was met with staunch opposition, as 10,000 local protesters gathered at the opening ceremony of the summit to denounce APEC. Over the following days, activists from a broad coalition of organizations hosted a people's countersummit against APEC, which they described as a forum that promotes the interests of big business and transnational corporations over the working class, the environment, and the cause of peace around the world. Joining The Real News today to discuss APEC and the People's Counter Summit is Nina Macapinlac, the Secretary General of Bayan USA, which stands for Bagong Alyansang Makabayan. Bayan is the first overseas chapter of Bayan Philippines, an anti-imperialist, multi-sectoral alliance of organizations fighting for national democracy in the Philippines. Nina serves on the steering committee of the U.S. country chapter of the International League of People's Struggle, or ILPS, an alliance of over 300 organizations around the world fighting imperialism. They also sat on the steering committee of the No to APEC Coalition that organized a counter-summit and mobilized against the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, which was hosted in San Francisco. Nina is based in Philadelphia. Nina, thanks so much for joining The Real News.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm hoping you can start by introducing our audience to you, to your organization, and if possible, to the new democratic movement in the Philippines.
Yeah, of course. So Bayan stands for Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, which Gian already explained, and it translates to New Patriotic Alliance. It is an anti-imperialist and multi-sectoral alliance of organizations fighting for national liberation and genuine democracy in the Philippines. As mentioned already, Bayan USA is the first overseas chapter of Bayan. And as an alliance, Bayan includes organizations from all sectors and oppressed classes of Philippine society, like youth and students, workers, peasants, women and gender oppressed people, even people of faith, health professionals, government workers, etc. All Bayan organizations are united in the analysis that the Philippines is semi-colonial and semi-feudal, meaning it remains subservient to the interests of its former colonial master, the United States, and semi-feudal in that it is purposefully underdeveloped as an agrarian country and primarily serves to provide cheap resources and labor to imperious powers like the US. Our goal as Bayan is to bring down the three fundamental problems of Philippine society, which is imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism, with a perspective of building a socialist society.
Thanks so much. Now, for those uninitiated, could you explain some of the basics of APEC? What is it? How did it come about? And why do Bayan and other organizations oppose it?
Yeah, so APEC describes itself as an intergovernmental forum to promote free trade in the Asia Pacific. It's a multilateral forum of 21 member economies, including the United States, Mexico, and China. It brings together economic and political leaders like heads of state, economic ministers, global industry giants, their corporate lobbyists, and billionaires. But They do not include representatives of vulnerable and impacted sectors like women and workers of the Global South, indigenous, environmental, and human rights advocates. So APEC was founded in 1989 in Australia and actually started with 12-member economies and has since grown. In 1994, they met in Indonesia to set up the goals of the organization, which is to eliminate all barriers to free trade and investment by 2020. APEC exists because the Asia Pacific is a very important region economically, especially to the United States. 75% of all global mining trade and investment are in the region and contains 7 of the top 10 overall trading partners for the US. The Asia Pacific is a destination for more than 60% of US goods. So Bayan and other orgs oppose APEC because it is a tool to advance imperialist economic and political interests in our home countries. APEC isn't a governing or regulatory body, but encourages countries to pursue bilateral or multilateral trade agreements that are extremely dangerous and harmful. The guiding theory and practice for APEC is neoliberalism, which supposedly promotes development and wealth in countries. But in actuality, neoliberalism promotes profit for the wealthy elite through privatization, which diminishes public services, deregulation, which loosens laws that regulate businesses' accumulation of profit, and liberalization, which relaxes the laws of a country to allow total freedom of foreign investments, goods, and services to maximize profit.
Thanks for that overview. I'm wondering if we can zoom in a little bit on the experience of the Philippines, since that is the country that your organization represents the most. What is the reality on the ground when we talk about, APEC existing to promote an imperialist economic framework? What does that mean for working people in the Philippines? Just taking that as an example.
Yes, that's a really good question. These measures ultimately will worsen Philippines' economic conditions, which is already in dire crisis. The Philippines has the highest inflation rate in Southeast Asia. Measures like IPEF and other free trade agreements would lessen restrictions and protections for workers, thus opening more opportunities for exploitation. It would mean driving up the costs of basic goods like food, oil, gas, water, which is already very unaffordable in the Philippines, but would make it even more so. Overseas workers' remittances would be worth less because of these increased prices, coupled with inflation in the US, leaving Filipino workers with less money to send home. So APEC and institutions like it hide behind green and technological innovations, which are really at the expense of everyday Filipinos, and reaps more profits through things like jeepney privatization. So there is like a big movement in the Philippines right now against the privatization of the traditional jeepneys, a very colorful public utility vehicles that the Philippines is known for. And Marcos, the president of the Philippines, is saying that it's in the name of promoting green technology, but really it means dashing the livelihoods of workers and also privatizing public transportation in the Philippines. So these are just some examples. I think another major thing is policies bartered through APEC would increase over-reliance on imports that disenfranchise peasants and farmers and maintains the agricultural sector as a means to produce cash crops for export. So those are what measures bartered through APEC would really mean for the Filipino people.
So, what you're describing there is really a process by which the entire Philippine economy is being remade for the benefit of capital that's primarily based out of the US, whether it's, taking over the agricultural sector, transforming the transportation system to benefit US transnationals, even at the level of what you were talking about remittances. I mean, the Philippines is engaged in such a massive pattern of the export of its labor, really the export of its people to economies like the US, where folks end up working in the healthcare sector as domestic workers, many, many other really critical service sectors, because they are drawn over by, the need to earn higher wages than are possible in the Philippines, right? So I think what you're really spelling out here is like an unequal relationship that exists between countries like the Philippines and countries like the United States. And the role of APEC, from what you're describing, seems to be to facilitate that. Would you say that that's correct?
Yes, that's exactly right.
You mentioned a little bit about IPEF, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Could you walk our audience through exactly what that is?
Yes, so the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is a US-led agreement, or they say framework because free trade agreement has become a bad word recently. So it's a framework with 13 countries, including India, which is actually not a member of APEC. Um, and it's a free trade agreement repackaged in post-pandemic language of fostering resiliency and climate smart, sustainable production. And IPEF is really the trade aspect of America's desperate attempt to gain the upper hand in its competition with China.
Could you say a little bit more about that last portion? The China US angle seemed to be really important at this most recent APEC summit. To provide the audience with a couple of examples, there was one kind of bizarre moment where President Biden called President Xi Jinping a dictator to his face, and then, when challenged on it, said, well, he's the leader of a foreign country with a system different than ours, so that makes him a dictator. I don't have a dictionary on hand, but I don't believe that's actually the definition. And then a day or two later, he got up during a meeting and then randomly hugged Xi Jinping in the presence of many other world leaders as well. So there was this kind of, you know, s- mercurial, sort of like ambivalent approach that the US was taking towards China throughout the summit, kind of. Uh, playing on the one hand, like extremely antagonistically at points, sometimes rudely, and at others, like sort of bizarrely flipping the script and attempting to engage in a little bit of rapprochement. So I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit to us, like how the U.S.-China angle fits into the politics of APEC at this time and the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I can also elaborate more. Um, Yeah, so the IPEF would set rules not only for trade, but also supply chains, clean energy, infrastructure, and taxes for over 3 billion people. The goal of the US is to really introduce this trade deal to create a framework and coerce less powerful countries like the Philippines to center their own domestic policies and their own economies around US interests. Um, and so the IPEF is really the latest effort of the US. And fortunately, it flopped, though supposedly they're going to expedite it in the coming weeks. But IPEF is the US's latest efforts to ensure control and assert power over the Indo-Pacific region as inter-imperialist conflict with China heightens. And China is actually launching their own trade agreement framework, which is called RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and it does not include the US. So IPEF is really a strategic economic and military measure to support US state interests and US corporate greed in the Asia Pacific region. And the goal of IPEF, and honestly, the US's main objective in APEC, is really to isolate China. So yeah, you mentioned those funny instances, and I think it really demonstrates the frenemy situation that the U.S. and China has, because they need each other in trade dealings, but at the same time they're competing imperialist powers. Um, and so I think that is an important thing to highlight in terms of APEC as a platform. APEC is important as a vehicle to reinforce and project U.S. hegemony and militarism in the Asia-Pacific region within the framework of the quote-unquote New Cold War that the U.S. has been unleashing on China. In line with its Indo-Pacific strategy, the U.S. backs up its trade agenda by deploying military forces, expanding overseas bases, and forging new military agreements with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and other countries in the Pacific to isolate and contain China. In general, that's how it works. Neoliberal policies and militarism go hand in hand. I guess just to zoom in into an example of an outcome of APEC in terms of these tensions between the US and China and how it affects countries like the Philippines that are essentially in the crosshairs of war. An outcome of APEC was the $672 million worth of investment pledges from US corporations that the Philippine government brought home. A Seattle-based ultra-safe nuclear corporation and the Manila Electric Company actually signed an agreement last week allowing the former to study the deployment of nuclear microreactors in the Philippines as a source of quote-unquote clean energy. And this was made possible by something called the 123 Agreement, which was signed by the US and the Philippines, allowing for the US to export nuclear technology and material to the Philippines. And so while this seemingly beneficial policy looks good on paper, looks good in terms of like clean energy, etc., the agreement would actually give USNC, the company, ability to fully control and profit from the resources in the Philippines, which has actually allowed 100% foreign ownership over clean energy projects. So you can see, direct impact on the national sovereignty of the country of the Philippines. And then furthermore, this storage of nuclear materials will set a precedent for the US to allow a nuclear arsenal to be stored in the Philippines. With the rising tensions between the US and China and the Philippines historically being a launching pad for war in the Asia Pacific, this is extremely dangerous for the Filipino people. We're already seeing ongoing war game exercises between the US, Philippines, South Korea, and Japan. So you can see, an example right there during the APEC week of how militarism and these neoliberal economic policies really serve each other at the expense of regular working people.
Thank you for walking us through that. It sounds to me like we could be looking at a Cuban Missile Crisis style situation in the Philippines if this sort of arrangement proceeds. And I would note that, there have been whispers and talks of the US deploying nuclear assets as well to the Korean Peninsula, to, like many other countries in the Asia Pacific. There was a recent deal with Papua New Guinea, whereby the US gained access to, I believe, the majority of its airports and its naval ports as well, which, can also be used towards mobilization for the sake of like a regional war, which would really engulf necessarily the entire world, since we're talking about one of the or really the most populated, economically significant regions on the planet. Um, I'm wondering, just diving in a little bit deeper on this issue, taking our audience through to understanding what the local political context in the Philippines is right now, given that, there was just the Duterte government. Now we see the return of Marcos. So, like, where is the Philippines politically at this time?
So currently, the son of dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., his name is Bongbong Marcos Jr., is in power after a 30-year-long disinformation campaign to allow his family to claw out of the hole of shame that they were in after the ouster of his family Yeah, so right now, Marcos Jr. Is really focusing on foreign investments, flooding the Philippines as a way of resolving the dire economic crisis that's happening. Like I mentioned earlier, the Philippines has the highest inflation rate in Southeast Asia currently, and prices keep skyrocketing every week. And people are making very meager wages. There's actually a recent mass struggle campaign to fight for a higher daily minimum wage, which is their demand was less than $15 a day. And that's how little workers in the Philippines make. Um, at most, they would make $12 a day under the current national minimum wage laws, and that's only if you're in the National Capital Region. In other places in the Philippines, people make as little as 13 cents a day, especially in the countryside. And the Philippines is actually a primarily agrarian country, so 75% of the population are peasant farmers. So in that light, instead of raising the minimum wage and trying to relieve the economic woes of the people, Marcos Jr. is actually going around trying to close in on these foreign investment deals that really will only enrich the wealthy elite in the Philippines. He's also currently trying to change the constitution of the Philippines, and which has actually been a thing that administrations have been trying to do for a long time. But that's one of his initiatives as well, trying to increase the term limits of the president, which is very reminiscent of his dictator father. Um, but yeah, basically the economic situation in the Philippines is very dire, and Marcos is really on this quest to rebrand dictatorship. He's really on this quest of promoting historical revisionism and changing the narrative on his family. Um, they even removed the Marcos's name in the recent People Power um commemoration day that the Philippines has, and just multiple attempts, honestly, of just trying to um wash away, the dishonor on their family name. um yeah, so I'll just stop there. But oh, I guess one other thing to note too is that Marcos has spent so much time abroad compared to actually being at home in the Philippines to govern. Um, his trip to San Francisco was his 18th trip abroad in just 16 months in office. Um, so you can really see that Marcos is selling out the Philippines to the highest bidder, most especially to the United States. And he's also proven that he'll continue to prioritize US interests, even at the expense of the Filipino people's well-being and our country's sovereignty. So while there's economic crisis is going on, he's out here bartering these investment deals. He's out here building these new US bases. Well, actually, they're Philippine bases that the US has access to, which is actually more insidious because then the Philippines has to build it and the US pays no rent to operate it. And if you notice, all of these bases that the US now has access to all face towards Taiwan and China. So you can really see that this Marcos is compliant to the escalation of the US against China, and really putting Filipinos in danger. We're already seeing like fishing communities being harmed by these military exercises that are happening near them where the bases are being constructed. And Marcos keeps saying that this is for the sake of protecting the Philippines sovereignty because China keeps making incursions on the West Philippine Sea, but so far there has been no actual change. Like China has just attacked a Philippine vessel recently, and so the U.S. keeps saying that they have this ironclad commitment to protect the Philippines, but we don't see it. We don't see any improvements. What we're seeing is actually creating the conditions for more aggression and violence in our country.
The point you just made kind of picks up on the South China Sea territorial disputes. I'm wondering, in your view, would the withdrawal of a U.S. presence help to allow for a more multilateral process of negotiation between the countries that actually border the South China Sea?
Yeah, I would say so. Um, so U.S. military pulling out of the Philippines, and also the U.S. just pulling out its, the economic dominance it has over the Philippines also affects the Philippines' ability to defend itself. If the Philippines is allowed to actually develop a strong national economy and build up its capacity for defense, the Philippines would have a stronger chance to actually build itself up and defend its national sovereignty. And the U.S. has no role in the affairs of Asian countries or any country for that matter. And so, we as Bayan, we call for U.S. out of the Philippines, both in the military and economic realms.
Thank you. Yeah. At the very least, you know, China does in fact border the South China Sea, and so, it's more of a logical party in terms of figuring out what exactly that maritime agreement should be. Whereas the United States is thousands of miles away, has no shore that borders the South China Sea. The Philippines does not count since, it's been nominally independent since at least the 1940s. Let's pivot to talking about the counter summit itself. So, Bayan and other organizations hosted a counter summit in San Francisco that was concurrent with the actual APEC summit occurring at the same time. Can you tell us a little bit about this event, what the goals of the counter summit were, and what happened there?
So the Note to APEC Coalition successfully held an anti-APEC counter summit that had about 1,000 people hosted in San Francisco. And the objectives were to expose and oppose APEC as an instrument for imperialist plunder, exploitation, and war. And at the summit, we also aim to increase people's understanding of neoliberalism's impacts, and current manifestations in local communities in the US and around the world, particularly oppressed peoples and nations in the Asia Pacific. So that was on November 11. And then on November 12th, the coalition then held a 10,000 person rally that marched to the gates of the APEC exclusion zone. And then throughout the week, we saw direct actions that disrupted and delayed the APEC activities, notably the APEC CEO Summit and Studies Consortium. There are also actions against the fascist heads of states throughout the week, like Philippines' Marcos, Japan's Kishida, Korea's Yoon, Peru's illegitimate Boluarte, and even Biden himself. So there's a united message of war criminals out of San Francisco. Throughout the week, the coalition also supported the many actions to free Palestine while the APEC heads of state were in town. Also, weapons manufacturers were in town as well. And one of these actions was the shutdown of the Bay Bridge, leading to the arrests of around 100 courageous activists. So that all happened that week. And at the summit itself, it was really an opportunity for organizers and participants to come together and not just talk about APEC, but talk about their struggles, especially national liberation struggles, the struggles of oppressed and marginalized communities here in the US and around the world. So I think that was something that was very important to us as a coalition, not just like exposing the details and impacts of APEC, but also the importance of uplifting people's struggles against imperialism as a whole. So there were groups that were ranging from Pacifica, Palestine, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, all sorts of organizations present at the summit. And it was really a beautiful demonstration of solidarity, especially since this APEC summit was the first global assembly since the start of the siege on Gaza. So Palestine was very much at the forefront of the summit and the mobilization as well.
What sort of alternate vision, speaking of, this sort of people-centered approach, what would a people-centered approach towards these questions of development and peace in the Pacific region look like, do you think? What is the vision that the No to APEC coalition could put forward as a counter to the vision that is that's represented by APEC itself?
Yes, so the coalition is very broad. It really brings together organizations that have different political stripes and visions of what an alternative world could look like. And so the coalition, I can't speak on the coalition basically, but I think broadly, the summit talked about the need for peoples to be able to determine their own destiny, to be able to have sovereignty of their nations, of their communities, and how APEC, as an instrument of imperialism, um, doesn't make it possible for that to happen. So I think in that respect, that's what we're united on. But in terms of like the details of that, because it is such a broad coalition, which is beautiful to see, I'm sure there's different visions of the type of world that these different organizations would want.
Perhaps a better way to phrase the question would be, how would you articulate that alternative vision?
Yeah, so Bayan actually has a program. So the points on our program that we would want for a free Philippines, but honestly would also extend to how we would view an alternative world for others. But of course, that's for other peoples to determine. So number one, we want to be able to uphold genuine national sovereignty. Um, Two, we want to be able to unite the Filipino people and build their collective strength. So really uniting the different classes of society to build the foundation for establishing a people's democratic state, which would then uphold civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Three, we want to build a self-reliant and progressive economy, which means dismantling the imperialist and feudal stranglehold on the Philippines economy and carrying out national industrialization and genuine land reform. We also give high premium to guaranteeing the people's economic and social well-being, meaning the new social order that we would want to build would liberate people from poverty, raise their standards of living, attain full employment, have adequate and humane working and social conditions, better standards for health, education, and housing. And then also, our vision is to promote a nationalist, scientific, and mass-oriented people's culture. Philippine culture right now is very colonial, patriarchal, and decadent. And so we would want to promote a culture that actually reflects the conditions of the Filipino people, promotes pride in Philippines, and also promotes their participation in building a country, a socialist country, and also participate in the movement for national and social liberation. We'd also uphold the right to self-determination of the Moro people and other national minorities in the Philippines, because we believe national minorities must be allowed to exercise their rights to own or control and utilize their ancestral lands. Also, fighting for women's liberation by destroying the basis of national class and gender oppression. Partake in building a strong anti-imperialist front in the world, meaning being able to work hand in hand with workers and other oppressed peoples. So yeah, that is the program of Bayan. Very broad strokes, and of course, a very big endeavor.
Well, that's certainly a huge undertaking, and all power to you and to Bayan for the work you have ahead and for your leadership in combating APEC and the general trend of US imperialism across the Pacific region. As we close out, how can our audience stay in touch with you?
Yes. So you can follow us on Instagram, and Facebook and Twitter. It's Bayan USA, on all of those platforms. And so I would say those are one of the best ways to stay in touch. We also have a website, bayanusa.org, that you can check out.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nina. And before we close out, I would like to also extend my thanks to our staff behind the scenes, helping make everything possible. That's David Hebden, Adam Coley. And thank you so much again to our listeners and our readers out there. This is The Real News, signing off. Stay in the streets, stay in the struggle. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for watching The Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work, so please tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to The Real News Network. Solidarity forever.